Every few years, there's a player that everyone talks about, especially at the quarterback position. Guys like Justin Fields, JT Daniels, Trevor Lawrence, Bryce Young, DJ Uyunglele, and Spencer Rattler come to mind. And now as we flash forward to 2024, there is a new name that the media and the college football world is obsessed with. His name is Dylan Raiola. Even though he went to like 3 or 4 different high schools and committed to like 3 or 4 different schools, Dylan Raiola is seen as a generational quarterback who could honestly make the NFL and save the Nebraska football program. People have been following Raiola for years now, and the same thing was being said this past weekend. People were comparing him to Patrick Mahomes, watching pretty much everything he did on the field, and now people are constantly talking about him. I thought I would give my opinion on Dylan Raiola and also introduce you to why he has so much hype. Today we're talking about who Dylan Raiola is, why he is seen as the next media quarterback, and also how he did in week 1. We're to give him a grade, we're to talk about what he can improve on, and how I also see the rest of his season going. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Dylan Raiola. Obviously, Dylan Raiola is a Husker legacy and pretty much football royalty in the Midwest. He's the son of former Nebraska and Detroit Lions offensive lineman Dominic Raiola, and he's the nephew of former Wisconsin offensive lineman and current Nebraska offensive line coach Donovan Raiola. He's also apparently the godson of Matthew Stafford, which is something I didn't even know, but given that football royalty and his last name, there were a ton of people early on that were trying to get him to be an offensive lineman instead of asking him where he actually wanted to play. His mom Yvonne said, quote, "People would say he's going to be a lineman like his dad. He's built solid, has a wide frame, and Dylan's always got thrown on the line, offensive or defensive, but as he got older, Dylan came to us and said he wasn't going to play football. Instead of quitting football though, he put a ton of work into becoming a quarterback. He met with former teammate of his dad, John Kitna, and asked to help become a quarterback to the best of his abilities. Coach Kitna was so impressed with his physical talents that he told him to never give up on the quarterback position, later saying, quote, he had a lot of mechanical stuff already in place and knew how to spin a football correctly. Dylan was born in Chandler, Arizona, but moved with his family to Burleson, Texas later on. As a JV starter, not even on varsity, 24/7 Sports liked him enough to list him as the number 3 quarterback in the class of 2024 already. Georgia offered him a scholarship in the summer before his sophomore year, and that is when things really started to take off. The floodgates would open. Washington State and Nebraska both offered him a few days later, as did Georgia, Baylor, TCU, and Florida State. His sister played volleyball at TCU, so that was also an interesting side note, and then teams like Mizzou also came in and went after him. This all happened before his sophomore season even started. While at Burleson High School, he didn't play his freshman year, but took over as a sophomore in 2021. During that season, he threw for 3,341 yards with 32 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. He also added 9 more scores on the ground, proving he was dynamic in both the running and passing game. That was a good enough reason for him to be instantly considered one of the best quarterbacks in his class, and 2024 was going to be a huge year for him. He's potentially seen as one of the best prospects in general, and eventually schools like Texas, USC, Alabama, and Ohio State agreed and offered him scholarships. By the end of the 2022 offseason, he had added more offers from Texas A&M, Oregon, Miami, and Penn State, as well as becoming the most sought-after recruit in the entire country. He moved back to Chandler during his junior season, throwing for 2,400 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 5 picks in 2022. This is where things get interesting, because then his recruitment started heating up and he decided to commit to Ohio State. This came the summer before his junior year, as he committed to the Buckeyes, but he still kept his visit schedule and didn't cancel any of his visits at all. He then took a visit to Nebraska during the season and decommitted from Ohio State, but he didn't remove them from his interest list and didn't immediately commit to Nebraska either. By early 2023, people now thought he was going to commit to Georgia. There was briefly some smoke around USC, but by May, he committed to the Georgia Bulldogs. This is when his senior year started, and he transferred to Buford High School in Georgia instead of Phoenix Pinnacle High School in Arizona, which led lots of people to believe he was just going to stay with the Bulldogs. As a senior in 2023, Raiola threw for 2,819 yards with 34 touchdowns and just 1 pick in Georgia's highest classification for high school football, leading the Buford Wolves to 11-2 record on the season and a spot in the quarterfinals of the playoffs. After the season was over, though, new Nebraska head coach Matt Rule threw a Hail Mary Dylan's way. They were desperate to sign him, so they decided to hire Chicago Bears assistant offensive line coach Donovan Raiola. This was Dylan's uncle, and he was now their new offensive line coach. It was enough to convince Dylan that his home was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and not in Athens, Georgia, so he decommitted from the Bulldogs and signed with Nebraska. And this made Lincoln, Nebraska look a whole lot more attractive whether he wanted to admit it or not. But playing for Nebraska is also a huge deal. They're super historic, they get a ton of clicks, the media loves them, and they have a lot of pageantry. At some point, some quarterbacks get to save that program, and they will get endless hype and praise, and will probably go into the Hall of Fame of that school. He ended up playing in the Polynesian Bowl in 2024, where he threw for 111 yards, a touchdown, and a pick. By the time he had graduated from Buford, Dylan was considered a 5-star prospect in the class of 2024, and the number 1 overall recruit from the state of Georgia, and number 7 overall. He was considered the second best quarterback in the class behind DJ Lagway of Florida, and ultimately that was kind of interesting. Already being 6'3" and 220 pounds, there wasn't much growing he was going to have to do to get on the field right away. He decided to enroll early to play spring ball at the Huskers, saying, quote, "I firmly believe that Nebraska is in my blood. It's a great opportunity to be a part of something bigger than myself, and Nebraska is a special place." So going into week 1, Dylan was named the opening day starter for the Huskers about a week before the opening game against UTEP. After his long recruiting journey and the weight of his dad's legacy at Nebraska on his shoulders, how would he end up doing in his first game? Well, the answer is he actually looked pretty dang good. He ended up going 19 of 27 passing for 238 yards and 2 total touchdowns. By the time we had reached halftime, he had already had 192, which some people were pointing out was almost as much as Nebraska had in some games last season. His favorite target was their new transfer Isaiah Nayor, who has an interesting story in itself, as he went from Wyoming to committing to Tennessee to going to Texas to getting hurt and now being at Nebraska. Long story short, he ended up catching 6 of those passes for 121 yards and a touchdown. The other went to Wake Forest transfer Jamal Banks, who also caught 4 passes for 61 yards to go along with that touchdown. He spread the ball around a little bit too, sending 3 passes to Janarin Bonner and Carter Nelson each. He didn't do much running on the day, which makes sense since Coach Rule wanted to keep him healthy for the rest of the season. Both Emmett Johnson and Dante Dowdell were doing just fine running the ball for him anyways, and the Husker coaching staff decided to pull Raiola in the third quarter to make sure he was healthy enough to start for their game against their old Big 8 foe, Colorado. Coach Rule said, quote, "If you prepare more this week than you did last week, then what were you doing last week? So Dylan, he'll double down on his process and practice hard and get ready for the game and go out and play. We'll play as hard as we can, and I'm sure he'll lay it all on the line." Honestly, it's just really hard to tell how good Dylan's performance is though, considering that UTEP is one of the worst teams in the country at the moment. They ended up going 3-9 last year and fired their head coach. They allowed 28.5 points per game, which was 88th in the country, obviously near the bottom. And then going into the season, they had a new coach, Scotty Walden, and he's pretty much had to rebuild them from scratch, and most of that rebuilding will have to take place in the defense since their top contributors graduated and left the program. So yes, Dylan looked really good, but he looked really good against the worst team in Conference USA. How loud of a volume does that really speak? That I can't really answer, but honestly, it's better than what Nebraska's done the last few years. I feel like half the time their quarterbacks don't do anything or struggle with interceptions, and no offense, but Heinrich Haarberg just is not as fun to watch as a guy like Raiola. This feels kind of like Adrian Martinez back in 2018, where there's a guy with a real ceiling and real swagger and real confidence who has real abilities and can actually make things happen. Raiola is still extremely young, and with that being said, Dylan ran the offense really well for Nebraska, and now has a ton of hype around him. Managing both those emotions and the expectations is going to be really tough, as Coach Rule and his father will have to keep him grounded, and that's the most impressive thing about his game. Coach Rule wasn't the only person who noticed it. His performance ended up blowing up in the media after the game. As for starters, he was named the Big Ten Offensive Freshman of the Week, and he's the first Husker to do that since Wan'Dale Robinson did back in 2019, which was 5 years ago. On Twitter, it's been even more all over the place, since he obviously got a ton of praise from Husker fans who have not seen good quarterback play in a while, but he also got the attention of Patrick Mahomes. It was kind of funny since a picture went around earlier this year where Dylan clearly looked like he was emulating Mahomes' off-the-field style and facial hair. That's probably how he got on Mahomes' radar, but he's already getting attention from big-time NFL players. Nebraska fans were thrilled, and Pat McAfee said, quote, "He oozes machismo." User Dirk Chatelaine said, quote, "In case you've forgotten, the difference between a mediocre quarterback and a good quarterback is basically everything." John Weiner said Dylan Raiola might save Nebraska football, but now you got to do it against Colorado. I don't remember the last time a Nebraska player, especially a quarterback, got this amount of hype from Cornhuskers fans after just one game than Dylan's getting right now. I'd probably argue that was Adrian Martinez if we're being honest here. If I had to grade him personally on the game, I would give him a B. There are a few plays where he could have done something even better or looked even more like a world beater, but honestly, if you're playing UTEP, you don't really have to open up the playbook that much and be all that good to win. So yeah, he ended up getting a B, and now we know his story and we know how he did, but how will he do the rest of the year? Well, there's still a long road ahead for Dylan. It's honestly not that realistic to expect him to be as good against the rest of the schedule as he was against UTEP. UTEP is a Conference USA team with a first-year head coach trying to rebuild a historically terrible school. This week they play Colorado and Coach Prime at home. I know the Buffs looked bad against North Dakota State, but they still have a really good secondary with Travis Hunter there. If Dylan looks good against them, they play Purdue, Ohio State, USC, and Iowa in the season, so there are a ton of good defenses in front of them. In terms of being a Nebraska quarterback, he might be the best Husker fans have seen in years, but again, he's a true freshman, he's played one game, and right now it's still a lot of hype and it's a lot of 5-star attention. He's going to make mistakes, he's going to have ups and downs, and he'll probably make them often. He's learning, and we'll find out just how good he really is over the course of the season, but Nebraska fans have a good reason to think the future is bright. But what do you guys think? If you're a college football fan, or especially a Nebraska fan, what do you think of Dylan Raiola? How do you think he'll do the rest of the year? And what other players should I do a report card video on next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.